Hello and welcome to PressTV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tafwi. The Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, which is supposed to protect Americans against abuse of government authority in a legal procedure. Or does it? A series of controversial bills have put that in question, such as the NDAA Act, not to mention an executive order instructing U.S. agencies to prepare for the declaration of a martial law called the National Defense Resources Preparedness, and now U.S. President Obama has issued a new executive order which allows the White House to control all private communications in case of emergencies. What other executive orders have been kept low-key, which privacy groups condemn as violation of personal freedom? Stay tuned for that in this edition of the PressTV News Analysis.
It's got a wordy title, Assignment of National Security and Emergency Preparedness Communications Functions. This order, according to the White House, allows federal agencies to control communications during natural disasters and security emergencies. However, privacy advocacy groups complain it gives the government unprecedented powers, including control over wired and wireless private networks. Obama reportedly kept the signing of the order as low-key as possible. Back in 2011, he signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act. That law initially included a section that allowed the president to detain people as long as he wanted through the U.S. Armed Forces. That section was later blocked by a federal court. U.S. laws that limit public freedoms are nothing new. A National Reconnaissance Office, for instance, has been snooping on people since the 1960s. Now, Obama's been accused of following in the footsteps of his predecessor, George W. Bush, in violating the rights of both American citizens and people overseas. His latest executive order authorizing communications control comes against the backdrop of national anti-capitalist protests, which are part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Washington often criticizes other governments of what it calls human rights violations and restrictions on the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. But facing similar complaints at home, it's now accused of using issues like human rights and democracy for political leverage.
Like human rights, we will continue to emphasize what we believe is the importance of recognizing.
Well, let me introduce our guests for this edition of the News Analysis. We have a human rights and international lawyer, Paul Wolf, joining us from Washington. From thiscan'tbehappening.net, Dave Lindorf joins us from Philadelphia. And senior editor at Veterans Today, Gordon Duff, joins us from Ohio. Gentlemen, welcome. I'd like to start with you, Dave Lindorf, looking at this executive order enabling the government to seize everyone's communications networks in case of emergencies. Maybe you could break this down for us, because it appears that it gives the government sweeping powers to collect private communication. And of course, they say in case of emergencies. And what does that mean, emergencies? It appears it gives the government wide latitude in what they consider an emergency to be.
Well, first of all, the decision on whether it's an emergency or not gets determined by the president. And so or by the whoever is in charge at that point. It might not be the president if the president's out of the country or something like that. It can be done by somebody else. So it's a very, very gray, murky kind of regulation. And this is a measure which has been talked about as far back, I think, at least as the Bush administration, maybe as far back as the Reagan administration. But with all of the backdoors and controls that the government has required that the telecom companies put into place, what we're talking about is the ability to actually grab control of the internet, grab control of the telecom system, and actually determine who is on it, who's allowed on it, who's cut off. All of those things will be in the control of whatever authority is in charge during a national emergency. So we're really talking about a kind of a martial law information setting.
Well, maybe you can clarify this for us, Paul Wolf, as a human rights and international lawyer in particular. There was a report that a correspondent gave which indicated that U.S. authorities have seized up to 1.3 million records of plain old Americans, this through the telephone carriers such as AT&T and Sprint, of which this is without the knowledge of the particular people that they targeted, which is called invasion of privacy by many of these advocacy groups. There's been authority already of which they've entitled themselves to go after these records to the tune of 1.3 million of them this past year. So what is this new executive order? Is it on top of this motion that has set them forward to obtaining private records of people, which dictates where they are, their text messages, and of course their phone conversations?
Well, Kaveh, I'm not familiar with the 1.5 million records you refer to, but certainly the National Security Agency is able to tap into all the major transmission systems, whether they be cell phone communications, the old Ethernet connections, cable, any way that people use the internet. Those connections inevitably pass through things like satellites or transatlantic cables that allow the National Security Agency to intercept vast amounts of information, much more than 1 million records. And then whatever legal restraints apply are applied afterwards. So in other words, if you have a right to be protected from an unlawful search of your communications, that would be after it was already intercepted by the NSA. I think that's how they view it anyway. What confuses me about the new bill that we're talking about is what exactly is the nature of the emergency that it's designed to address. Because you know that the internet was designed to be indestructible. It was designed back in, I believe, the 1970s to survive a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, so that even if major cities in the United States were destroyed in nuclear holocausts, somehow the internet would still work because there was still some method for computers to communicate with each other. So we don't really have to worry about any adversary, even Soviet Union in a nuclear attack, destroying the internet and taking it down. So what exactly is the threat that they're worried about? And I think that the introduction to your show suggested one possible motive would be actually to shut down the internet, not to make sure that it's maintained for public service warnings, but to shut down the internet. And I would only look at that as an extremely paranoid view, whether it has to do with Occupy Wall Street or some type of foreign threat. We've never really had, in the whole history of the United States, any kind of law that would allow the government to completely shut down communications. So I think it's unprecedented. I think it's really a power grab by the Obama administration, and I think it should be met with some opposition and challenged and explained, why do you need this power? What exactly is it that you're trying to do?
Gordon Duff, most Americans have never heard of this thing. It's called the National Reconnaissance Office, nor of its slogan. The slogan reads, vigilance from above. The agency has made headlines with the revelation from McClatchy newspapers that they have been illegally collecting large amounts of information about U.S. citizens through unethical polygraph practices. Why does the U.S. government need so many different agencies spying on Americans? And as our guest there prior alluded to, why is the U.S. and its government so paranoid?
Well, one of the interesting things is, among others, I'm one of the people who used to write the intelligence analyses for the U.S. Senate and for the President of the United States. And when you realize that you have overheard billions of conversations around the world and hand them to a person who only reads 100 words of text a day, you begin to see the absurdity in this. One thing I think we've missed here, and this is a direction I think that we're looking away from, is within the United States. We believe there is a domestic threat. Now, the U.S. government, I think, has some bizarre ideas what the domestic threat might be, that it's occupied people who, I believe and support entirely. But on the other hand, we're in the midst of an election. The election is between President Obama, who, despite how he talks, is a supporter of peaceful relations with Iran, though he speaks otherwise, though even President Putin of Russia could be accused of making belligerent statements toward Iran last week, if one were to misconstrue, as the Israeli press had indicated. The problem is that President Obama is the most liberal and trustworthy person we have to deal with, has the broadest support, and that his opposing candidate, by my impression, and I'm an intelligence industry professional, represents the most draconian forces, 1,000 times worse than Obama, is a representative of world drug dealing, organized crime, and Wall Street. And if anything, Obama, I have to admit, we all have to list a great number of sins and a great number of disappointments. Even people within the military are universally going to support Obama. One of the things I'd like to remind everyone of is that sitting here in the United States, I print a publication that goes out daily to 600,000 people, and I say absolutely what I want. If I were in Canada, Germany, Britain, or France, I would be in prison right now. We have news agencies in 34 countries. When I talk on the phone to our editors around the world, in very few countries are they allowed to speak freely. The U.S. is the last bastion, and yes, I recommend that we hold on to what we have, but also recognize that everywhere else, across Western Europe, even in Canada, they live under a totalitarian government in Canada, and they talk about their freedom. There is no freedom of speech in Canada. None in Germany, none in France, none in Britain, none in Italy. There is none, and certainly none in Russia whatsoever. That the U.S., as bad as it is all that's left, which that's why the three of us here are very frightened at this.
Well, let's look at some other executive orders here, David Lindoff. We have the recent and controversial NDAA Act, an order instructing U.S. agencies to prepare for the declaration of martial law, and then laws like the trespass bill, and then you have the eavesdropping law. It's been adopted in 12 states so far, not to mention George Bush Jr.'s Patriot Act. Tell us, what is the U.S. setting its citizens up for? Because there's been an escalation recently, it appears, from the U.S. President Barack Obama.
Well, first of all, let's distinguish, because you're mentioning bills that are passed into law, like the National Military Act and the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, and executive orders. The acts are actually passed by Congress, and in some ways they're even more scary because what they show is that we don't even have a restraint on these assaults on freedom of expression and freedom of communication, because the Congress is passing these laws. As you mentioned, that one has a fraction of it has been stopped by a lower federal court, but that's almost inevitably going to get overturned by a higher court. And when it gets to the Supreme Court, you can sort of tell where that's going to go. So we don't have any restraints, and these things are being passed into laws. The executive order you're talking about is something else. That's something that's done by the president. It's not a law. It's treated like a law, but it can easily be challenged in court. And a lot of the acts that were signed by, executive orders rather, that were signed by President Bush were restrained or overturned by federal courts. So a presidential executive order is less dangerous in some ways than where you see a Patriot Act passed or an NDAA passed into law. The scary thing, I think, is not so much that President Obama is signing these relatively secret executive orders, but the fact that our members of Congress are passing these laws and the American public is not turning them out of office on their ears for passing these robberies of our freedoms and overturnings of our Bill of Rights.
Paul Wolf, but what's interesting is maybe it's a case-by-case basis, but we're looking at the civilian side of the government, organizations on the civilian side overlooking some of these executive orders, but then some are handed over to military organizations. What is the danger that poses when it falls under the military, so to speak, umbrella?
Well, of course, the executive order that you mentioned does involve interagency committees, including either the Department of Defense or some military agency, I forget which. The Department of Homeland Security is the one that is supposed to head up the program. That's a civilian agency. But there's always been a reluctance among the American people to have the military directly involved in domestic law enforcement. And that's just a cultural bias we have. We would rather have a separate military and civilian system. So, you know, I think that that your previous guest also made a very important distinction, but I do want to add my 2 cents that this is an executive order, it's not a law. This is simply the Obama administration grabbing legal turf and saying this is what we're going to do, this is what we think we can do. Now, it may be possible to challenge these things in court, but think of how difficult it would be. I've contemplated these kind of cases. If you have a person who says, I think that I was illegally put under surveillance by the government, how is that person going to prove that case in court? That is a virtually impossible case to prove, and the person would be thrown out of court immediately for bringing a claim without having any evidence. So they're actually difficult to challenge by an average person in court. Congress could certainly pass a law limiting the president's powers, but again, it becomes complex as to what authority does the president have to enforce the law versus Congress's power to make the law. So I would say that this is going beyond an enforcement type issue, that the president's really setting policy. He's determining that we're in a more extreme state of danger than we were before this election cycle, so we're going to have tougher laws, and he's doing it essentially by fiat. So I think that some type of response is required. You know, it doesn't go into effect for 30 days. So I think it's probably a good time for people to raise their objections. And then whatever mechanism exists, whether it be Congress or someone trying to challenge in court, I hope that that's done.
Well, Paul Wolf, I'm not a lawyer, but I read this new executive order. And the last line of the entry that I read this order indicated that this cannot be challenged in a court of law, if I understood it correctly. But let's move on. Gordon Duff, recently the Department of Homeland Security, I don't know if you recall, they purchased up to 700, well, this is a guesstimate, but up to 750 million rounds of deadly ammo, which raised a lot of eyebrows why they needed to purchase this. It appears that the government in the States is focusing itself on dangers on its soil. Why has this accelerated up to this point? I mean, is the Occupy movement perhaps their primary concern here?
Well, one of the biggest concerns I think all of us have is that the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, and it brings to mind the German term Reich when they speak of homeland. It's certainly not a term any American uses. It's a duplication of powers that is expanded well beyond the legal checks and balances of our Constitution. Almost every one of these acts, almost every one of the things the military has tried to take on itself is a violation of existing American laws. And a court system that functioned, and has been carefully mentioned, our court system does not, would have overturned this. The military was prohibited from any involvement in U.S. security on domestic soil in 1878 by an act called the Posse Comitatus. And the issue here, of course, is that all of these laws that are being passed, all of these presidential fiats that are being passed, deny the issues of due process and equal protection within the Constitution. All are outside of the laws of the United States, and all of the individuals who are involved in passing these laws that the American people seem to accept rather quietly are actually available for criminal prosecution.
Like in what?
Passing an illegal law is a crime.
Right, and Americans, of course, if they're aware that these laws are even being passed, we're looking at a case over here, Dave Lindorf, if you have me, of democracy, basically freedom coming in the form, let's say, of the Fifth Amendment. Is the U.S. government in due time for a revision because of all these executive orders and different laws that are being passed?
We don't have to be afraid at the moment that we live in a police state. I think it's time for people to have to stand up and really say, stop. this is too far, this is too much, this is not our country anymore, we want it back. That's the way I see it. I see it as a huge threat that is about to happen, and usually when these kinds of powers exist, they get used.
And Paul Wolf, it's a good time to bring you in here. How can Americans stop? You mentioned that it's very hard if they were to be, for any reason, prosecuted without them knowing that their, let's say, phone records have been accessed. How can they stand up for their rights? What choices or options do they have?
Well, I haven't thought of one for an individual who believes that their phone conversations have been illegally monitored, and I represent some very controversial people, so I'm one of them who's concerned that my communications may be monitored, but I can't prove it, so I have no business being in court, and if I went to court, I would lose. I would say that really the only way to affect this situation is through the ordinary political process. And I think that people who consider themselves to be liberals, who still support President Obama, have to really take a hard look at what is happening. Because Obama may be liberal on economic issues and domestic social issues, but he's certainly not liberal when it comes to security issues or foreign policy issues. And I think we've really been letting him get away with that. As one of your other guests said, he's the most honest, the best guy to deal with. Maybe he's the best choice that's out there. But that doesn't mean that we should let him get away with this, because really things get worse every year, and the freedoms that we have are more and more restricted year after year after year, and a continuous process that may have been started by George Bush or maybe was ongoing before then, but Obama has certainly made things worse. And I think that people who call themselves liberals or progressives have to really put their foot down and make sure that these issues are on their agenda as well, and they won't just go for Obama because they don't like the Republicans. I think that that's a big mistake. So we still have 30 days before this policy goes into effect, and I think that President Obama, he should be advised by people who support him that they don't like this, and he's going to lose some of their support if he goes ahead with it.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you very much. Human rights and international lawyer Paul Wolf, we appreciate it. From thiscan'tbehappening.net, Dave Lindorf from Philadelphia, also senior editor of Veterans Today, Gordon Duff from Ohio. Thank you. And thank you, the viewer, for watching another edition of the Press TV News Analysis. Do send us any comments or suggestions, newsroom@presstv.ir. That's our email address. From me, Kaveh Takveli, and the entire team here in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.